It was late, the kind of quiet night where every small sound seems magnified. Emily sat in her dimly lit apartment, cradling a chipped mug of tea, letting the warmth seep into her hands. The world outside felt distant, like a faint hum she could barely register. Then came the knock. Sharp, sudden, and deliberate, it broke through the stillness, sending a chill through her. She froze, her heartbeat quickening as her eyes darted to the door. Who could it be at this hour? Her life rarely invited surprises, and when it did, they weren't usually good ones. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Emily set her mug down, the clink of ceramic against the table loud in the silence. Slowly, she rose to her feet, the floor creaking beneath her weight as she approached the door. Hesitation gripped her. She wasn't expecting anyone. She wasn't sure she wanted to. The door creaked open, just a crack at first, and then wider. Standing there, bathed in the faint light of the hallway, was a man she recognized instantly. The diner, the stranger. His clothes were as worn as they'd been then, but his face held a different expression now, one she couldn't quite place. His eyes, once downcast and weary, now bore something sharper, something that made her chest tighten. She didn't speak at first, neither did he. They stood there, locked in an exchange of unspoken questions. Why was he here? How had he found her? The silence stretched, heavy with tension and curiosity. He looked away, shifting his weight awkwardly. She tightened her grip on the door, unsure if she should invite him in or shut him out. And then it came rushing back, the moment at the diner. The way he'd sat alone in the corner, staring at the menu like it held secrets he couldn't decode. She had noticed the hesitation in his hands, the way he avoided the server's gaze. There was something about him that had pulled at her, a quiet desperation she couldn't ignore. She had walked up to him, offering a soft smile that she hoped masked her own exhaustion. "Order whatever you like," she said. "Don't worry about it." He looked at her, then really looked at her, his eyes wide with surprise and something else. Gratitude, maybe, or disbelief. "You're too kind," he murmured. "Thank you." That thank you had stayed with her. Even as she'd returned to her shift, even as she'd wondered if she'd made a mistake, she wasn't exactly in a position to be generous. Her own groceries had to stretch thin that week, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd done the right thing. And then there were his parting words as he left the diner. "You don't know what you've done for me." Now standing in her doorway, she wondered if she'd been wrong. She studied him, searching his face for answers, but all she found was the same unreadable expression that had left her curious that night. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but steady. "I needed to see you." Her grip on the doorframe tightened as she tried to steady herself. She wanted to ask why. She wanted to demand answers, but the words caught in her throat. There was something in his tone, something urgent, something that told her whatever he had to say would change everything. Emily's days began before sunrise, the world still wrapped in a cold, quiet haze. The diner opened early, and so did she. The sound of clinking dishes and faint conversations was her constant companion, her routine so ingrained it felt like breathing. A young woman in her mid-20s, Emily had mastered the art of keeping a smile on her face, even as exhaustion weighed heavily on her shoulders. Her life was an endless cycle of double shifts and late nights. The customers barely noticed the strain in her eyes or the tremble in her hands as she carried steaming plates of food. But Emily pushed through it all with quiet determination. She didn't have the luxury of rest. Every dollar she earned went toward bills, groceries, and the growing pile of rent notices she could no longer ignore. At home, the reality was harsher. Her apartment was a testament to survival, leaking faucets, peeling wallpaper, and the hum of an old refrigerator that seemed to groan in protest. It was far from the life she'd imagined for herself. Her dreams of owning the bakery felt like whispers of another time, buried under the weight of her mother's illness and the demands of simply making it through each day. Her mother depended on her now. The once vibrant woman was a shadow of her former self, needing medicine and care Emily could barely afford. Emily didn't complain. She simply endured, her love for her mother giving her strength when everything else seemed to crumble. But it was hard. Hard to ignore the ache of dreams deferred, the feeling that life had passed her by. Still, Emily's kindness shone through, even in her darkest moments. She was the type of person who offered free coffee refills to regulars who were struggling or stayed a few minutes after her shift to listen to an elderly customer's stories. Her coworkers often teased her, saying she cared too much, but Emily didn't see it that way. Kindness wasn't something she could switch off. It was who she was. The regulars at the diner adored her for it. "You're a light in this place," an old man once told her. She laughed it off, but deep down she cherished the words. They reminded her that, despite her own struggles, she still had the power to make someone's day a little brighter. That morning was no different, at least at first. The sun had just started to peek through the windows when he walked in. The man looked out of place, unkempt, weary, and carrying an air of heaviness that seemed to hang over him like a storm cloud. Emily noticed him immediately. He didn't belong among the chatter of the morning rush, the clatter of plates and laughter of regulars. He chose a corner booth, far from the warmth of the counter where most people gathered. His gaze darted nervously around the room, and his hands rested on the table, fingers twitching slightly. Emily studied him for a moment, her instincts telling her there was more to this story than met the eye. When she approached his table, he didn't look up. His eyes were fixed on the menu, as though it held the answers to unspoken questions. She saw his hesitation, the way he fingered the edges of the menu but didn't open it. There was something about his expression, an unspoken plea hidden beneath layers of exhaustion. Emily didn't need to ask. She'd seen that look before. Quietly, she placed a hand on the edge of the table and said, "Order whatever you like. Don't worry about it." Her voice was steady, but her heart tightened. She wasn't sure she could afford this. Groceries for the week were already a stretch, but something inside her couldn't let him walk away hungry. The man looked up, his eyes meeting hers for the first time. They were filled with surprise, confusion, and a flicker of something she couldn't quite place. Gratitude, maybe. I can't," he stammered. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," Emily replied gently, "but I want to." For a moment, he said nothing, his lips pressing into a thin line as if he was trying to hold back words that would betray him. Then, with a quiet nod, he murmured, "Thank you." The man ordered the simplest meal on the menu, a bowl of soup and a slice of bread. As Emily walked back to the kitchen, she could feel the stares of her coworkers. One of them, a sharp-tongued waitress named Karen, muttered under her breath, "You're too nice for your own good, Emily. He's probably not even going to say thank you." Emily didn't respond. She'd heard it all before, but her heart told her she'd done the right thing. As she placed the order, she allowed herself a small smile. Kindness wasn't about getting something in return. It was about giving what you could, even when it wasn't easy. When the man finished his meal, he stood to leave, pausing at the counter. Emily looked up from the coffee pot, surprised to see him lingering. He seemed to struggle with his words before finally speaking. "You don't know what you've done for me," he said, his voice steady but filled with an intensity that left her speechless. And then he was gone, leaving Emily standing there, the weight of his words sinking into her. She didn't know what he meant. She didn't know his story or why he'd come to her diner that morning. But as she watched him walk out the door, she couldn't shake the feeling that her small act of kindness had touched something deeper. The questions lingered long after he left. Who was he? What had brought him to that moment of desperation? And what did he mean by those final words? Emily didn't have answers, but she carried the mystery with her, a quiet hope that, somehow, she'd made a difference. Emily's life was a delicate balancing act. Every day, she clocked in at the diner before the sun rose, bracing herself for another grueling shift. The smell of coffee and frying bacon filled the air, masking the exhaustion etched into her face. Her routine was relentless, serving plate after plate, smiling at customers while her thoughts wandered to the stack of unpaid bills waiting for her at home. She'd count her tips at the end of the day, already dividing them in her head, some for the rent, some for her mother's medicine, and a little for groceries. It was never enough. The rent notices came more frequently now, their language more urgent. She fought the creeping despair with every ounce of her strength, telling herself she just had to get through one more day. But hope felt like sand slipping through her fingers. At home, the weight of her responsibilities grew heavier. Her mother, once so full of life, now spent her days in bed, her frail body betraying her spirit. Emily did everything she could, buying medicine, cooking meals, making sure she was comfortable. She kept her worries to herself, never letting her mother see how scared she was. The loneliness was suffocating. There was no one to share the burden, no one to lean on. But Emily's love for her mother kept her going, even as it broke her heart a little more each day. Her kindness had always been a part of her. She couldn't turn it off, even when it came at a cost. That day at the diner, when the stranger walked in, she hadn't thought twice. He looked so lost, sitting in the corner with nothing but a menu in front of him. She knew that look. Hunger, pride, fear of asking for help. It had taken her all of 10 seconds to decide. "Order whatever you want," she told him. "It's on me." The man's face had been a mixture of gratitude and shame, his voice barely audible as he said, "Thank you." It was a small thing, just a meal, but Emily knew it wasn't small to him. What she didn't know was the ripple that single act of kindness would create. Her grocery budget stretched thin that week. Then came the landlord's knock, a warning this time. Pay up or face eviction. The guilt gnawed at her. She'd done what felt right, but had it been reckless? She replayed the moment over and over in her head, questioning her decision as her world grew more uncertain. Work wasn't a refuge anymore. Her boss had started to notice her distraction. "Emily," he'd snapped one afternoon, "focus on the customers who pay, not the ones you feel sorry for." His words stung, but she bit her tongue. Even her coworkers had begun whispering, "She's too soft," they'd say, "always putting others first." It hurt, but she wouldn't let them see. What Emily couldn't know was the depth of the stranger's story. He hadn't always been this way. Once, he was a man of success and influence, running a thriving business, but betrayal had a way of unraveling everything. Partners he trusted had turned their backs, leaving him to shoulder the weight of their mistakes. The business collapsed, and with it, so did his life. He tried to rebuild, but each failure pushed him further from the man he once was. His family grew distant, his daughter cutting ties after one too many broken promises. Shame became his constant companion, a voice that reminded him of his failures every time he closed his eyes. By the time he walked into that diner, he was a shadow of the person he'd been, carrying nothing but regret and the faintest hope that maybe, just maybe, someone might see him as more than his mistakes. That meal meant more than Emily could have imagined. For the first time in months, he felt something other than shame. He felt seen. Her kindness sparked a tiny ember inside him, one he hadn't felt in years. But with it came guilt. How could he accept generosity from someone who clearly had her own struggles? He wrestled with the contradiction, replaying her words in his mind. "It's on me." What did she see in him that made her believe he was worth helping? Meanwhile, Emily's doubts grew. She'd acted on instinct, but now the consequences loomed over her. Late at night, in the quiet of her apartment, she prayed silently for strength. Was she naive to believe that small acts of kindness mattered, or was she holding onto the only thing that gave her life meaning? As the days passed, her questions deepened, but one thing remained clear. She couldn't change who she was, even if it meant facing the uncertainty alone. And somewhere, the man she'd helped began to find a spark of courage. He didn't know how, but he was determined to repay the kindness of the woman who'd seen him when no one else did. The smallest light in the darkness can change everything. For both of them, the journey was only beginning. Emily's belief in kindness had always been her anchor. Even as bills piled up and her long hours at the diner seemed endless, she held on to the idea that compassion was never wasted. It was how she made sense of the chaos around her. Each smile she gave, each small act of generosity, these were the pieces of herself she refused to let the world take away. But at night, as she sat in her tiny apartment with the flickering light bulb above her, doubts began to creep in. Had she given too much this time? Could her kindness really make a difference? Those doubts weren't entirely her own. Her best friend, Lila, voiced what Emily was afraid to admit. "You're too kind for your own good, Emily," Lila said one afternoon, her tone a mix of concern and frustration. "You barely have enough for yourself, and now you're helping strangers?" Emily clenched her hands around her coffee cup, not meeting her friend's gaze. "I couldn't just ignore him, Lila. He looked like he hadn't eaten in days." "That's not your responsibility." Lila's voice softened, but the edge of worry remained. "What if helping him means you end up on the street? You have to think about yourself for once." The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they carried a truth Emily didn't want to face. That night, as she replayed the conversation in her head, she felt a small crack in her resolve. Was Lila right? Was she sacrificing too much for people who might not even remember her tomorrow? The next day at the diner, Emily's thoughts lingered on that question until a familiar customer interrupted her spiral. He was one of her regulars, an older man who often came in with a newspaper tucked under his arm. That day as he left, he slipped a folded piece of paper under his coffee cup. When Emily picked it up, she found a note inside with a tip much larger than usual. The note read, "The world needs more people like you. Don't ever stop being you." Emily felt her breath catch. In that moment, the weight of her doubts eased just a little. It wasn't much, just a kind word and a small gesture. But it reminded her why she held on to kindness in the first place. It was a light in the darkness, and sometimes that was enough. No matter how hard things got, Emily never let her struggles show at work. She continued to care for her customers with the same warmth she always had. At home, it was a different story. Her mother's health was worsening, and the bills seemed endless. Still, Emily prioritized her mother's needs over her own, quietly making sacrifices she never mentioned to anyone. Each day, she found strength in the act of giving, even when it left her with nothing. Far from the diner, the man Emily had helped was grappling with his own demons. There was a time when he was someone people respected. He owned a small business, one that supported his family and gave him purpose. But betrayal had turned that life to ash. Trusted partners had abandoned him, leaving him to bear the weight of failure alone. The collapse of this business was only the beginning. His family, tired of the broken promises and endless apologies, had drifted away. His daughter, once his closest confidant, stopped answering his calls. He often thought about those days, about the man he used to be. The memories were like shards of glass, sharp and painful, but something had shifted since that day at the diner. Emily's simple act of kindness had sparked a faint glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make him wonder if he could be more than his failures. That hope led him to a decision he'd been avoiding for years. His daughter lived nearby, though they hadn't spoken in ages. He spent hours pacing outside her apartment building, rehearsing what he'd say. "I'm sorry" felt too small, but it was all he had. Inspired by Emily's courage, he knocked on the door. When it opened, he saw the shock in his daughter's eyes. She didn't say much at first, but she didn't turn him away either. It was a start. Small changes followed. The man began taking odd jobs, cleaning up his appearance and searching for ways to rebuild his life. He carried Emily's words with him like a talisman, a reminder that even the smallest kindness could change everything. Unknown to Emily, the man had started watching her from a distance. It wasn't out of malice, but a deep sense of gratitude. He saw her strength, the way she carried herself despite the struggles he could only imagine. He noticed the way she interacted with her customers, always with a smile, even when the weight of the world seemed to rest on her shoulders. He felt both indebted to her and inspired by her. One day, as he stood outside the diner, he overheard a heated conversation. Emily's landlord was berating her in the parking lot, his voice loud enough to draw attention. "I've given you enough chances, Emily. If I don't have the rent by the end of the week, you're out." The man watched as Emily's shoulders slumped, her voice barely audible as she apologized and promised to figure something out. The scene stirred a storm of emotions in him. Anger at the injustice, guilt for his own part in her struggles, and a fierce determination to make things right. That night, he sat in his small rented room planning. He didn't have much, but he had enough to help her. And this time it wasn't about repaying a debt. It was about passing on the hope she had given him, about proving that kindness could create something greater than either of them had imagined. Emily's act of generosity had set something in motion, and now it was his turn to continue the journey. Together, they would find redemption, not just for him, but for both of them. The evening was quiet, the kind of stillness that makes every small sound echo. Emily sat at her small kitchen table, flipping through overdue notices and crumpled receipts. The familiar weight of worry settled on her chest, but she pushed it aside, focusing on the tea in her hands. Then a knock broke the silence. It wasn't timid or hesitant. It was steady, purposeful. She froze, her heartbeat quickening. 7 days had passed and she saw him at the diner, but her thoughts often wandered back to that encounter. Now, an inexplicable sense of anticipation gripped her as she moved toward the door. When she opened it, there he was, the man from the diner. He looked different this time. His clothes, though still modest, were clean, and his eyes no longer carried the same weight of despair. In his hands, he held a worn envelope and a folded letter. Emily's fingers tightened on the doorknob, 1,000 questions swirling in her mind. "I needed to see you," he said softly, his voice steadier than she remembered. "There's something I need to tell you." She nodded, stepping aside to let him in. He stood near the window, his gaze distant as he began to speak. "I wasn't always the man you met that day. Once I had everything, a business, a family, a purpose. People used to look at me with respect." His voice faltered for a moment before he continued. "But life has a way of unraveling things when you least expect it. The people I trusted turned on me. My business collapsed, and I couldn't fix it." Emily listened in silence, her chest tightening as he spoke. She could feel the weight of his words, the raw honesty in every syllable. "I lost more than money. I lost myself. My daughter, she stopped speaking to me, said she couldn't watch me drown in my failures anymore." He paused, his eyes glistening. "For years, I wandered, trying to find meaning in a life that felt empty. By the time I walked into that diner, I was ready to give up." Emily's breath caught, but she said nothing, letting him continue. "But then you," his voice softened and he turned to face her. "You changed everything. With one small act, you reminded me that there's still good in this world. You didn't know me, yet you helped me. That meal, it wasn't just food. It was hope. It was a reason to keep going." He held out the envelope with trembling hands. "I've been saving what I could, picking up odd jobs, trying to put my life back together. This is for you." Emily's brows furrowed as she hesitated. "I don't understand." "It's enough to cover your rent, your mother's medical bills, and maybe even start that bakery you dreamed about. I know it's not much, but it's everything I have." Her hands shook as she took the envelope, her fingers brushing against the paper's worn edges. Inside, she found crisp bills and a handwritten letter. She couldn't speak. Her throat tightened as tears blurred her vision. For so long, she had carried her burdens alone. Now, this stranger, this man she barely knew, had given her the one thing she thought she'd lost: hope. Tears streamed down her face as she tried to find the right words. I don't know how to thank you." "You already have," he said gently, "by showing me that even in my darkest moment, kindness still exists." She looked at him, her vision swimming, and saw the man before her in a new light. He wasn't just someone she had helped. He was a reflection of everything she believed in: the power of compassion, the strength of human connection. "I never thought," she began, her voice trembling, "that something so small could matter so much." "It does," he said firmly. "It always does." The moment between them was quiet but profound, a shared understanding that words couldn't fully capture. For Emily, it wasn't just the relief of financial stability. It was the realization that her kindness had rippled outward, touching lives in ways she couldn't have imagined. For the man, it was redemption, a chance to rebuild not just his life, but also his spirit. As he turned to leave, he stopped at the doorway and looked back. "You reminded me," he said, his voice steady, "that even when you have nothing, kindness can change everything." Emily watched him walk away, her heart full. The envelope felt light in her hands, but its contents carried a weight far greater than money. It was hope. It was purpose. It was proof that even in the darkest times, light could find its way in. That night, as she sat at her table, the bills and notices still in front of her, she felt something she hadn't in a long time. The burdens were still there, but they no longer felt insurmountable. She had been reminded of something she had always believed deep down: kindness, no matter how small, could transform the world. And for the first time in years, Emily allowed herself to dream. The morning light poured into Emily's tiny apartment, but for the first time in years, it didn't feel oppressive. The pile of overdue bills was gone, replaced with a single receipt: the rent paid in full. Her mother's medicine sat neatly on the kitchen counter, no longer a source of worry. There was peace now, a quiet sense of relief that wrapped around her like a warm blanket. For years, she had carried burdens too heavy for one person, but now they had lifted, and she could finally breathe. The money had been a gift, but it was the gesture behind it that moved her. It wasn't just about the bills. It was about being seen, being understood in a way she hadn't expected. And with that understanding came something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. In the days that followed, Emily's kitchen transformed. The small space, once filled with worry and uncertainty, became her haven. She pulled out her mother's old recipe book, the pages yellowed but still legible. Flour dusted the counters, and the aroma of baked bread and sweet pastries began to fill the air. It was a dream reborn, one she had almost let go of. She started small, offering her baked goods to the regulars at the diner. "Just try it," she'd say with a shy smile. "Let me know what you think." The response was overwhelming. Customers began asking for more, placing orders for pies, cakes, and bread. Her talent, honed in quiet moments over the years, was finally being recognized. Word spread quickly. Neighbors started stopping by her apartment, and the diner became a hub for her creations. With each sale, her confidence grew, and for the first time, the dream of owning her own bakery didn't feel so far away. It was as though every challenge she had faced had led her here, to this moment of possibility. Far from Emily's kitchen, the man who had once been a stranger stood outside a door he hadn't approached in years. His hand shook as he knocked, unsure of what to expect. When the door opened, his daughter stood there, her face a mixture of surprise and guarded emotion. "I don't know if I deserve your forgiveness," he began, his voice thick with regret. "But I need to tell you how sorry I am. For everything." There was silence, the kind that stretched endlessly, but then she stepped aside and let him in. They talked for hours, years of pain and distance slowly dissolving with each word. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't instant, but it was a start. For the first time in years, he felt the fragile beginnings of a connection he thought he had lost forever. The man's life began to change, not just because of his daughter, but because of the spark Emily had reignited in him. He took what little he had and started an outreach program in the community, offering meals and support to those experiencing homelessness. He knew what it felt like to have nothing, to feel invisible, and he wanted to be a voice of hope for others. It started small: a hot meal, a warm blanket, a kind word. But soon the impact grew. People began to gather, not just for the resources, but for the sense of connection. His story, once filled with loss and failure, became a source of inspiration. He often thought of Emily during those moments, of how her small act of kindness had set everything in motion. In the weeks and months that followed, the ripple effect of that day at the diner became clear. Emily's light blossomed, her talent recognized by a community eager to support her. The man found purpose in helping others, rebuilding his relationship with his daughter along the way. But the impact extended beyond just the two of them. Emily's regulars began sharing her story, encouraging acts of kindness in their own lives. The man's outreach program inspired others to give, creating a network of support that stretched further than he could have imagined. It was proof that one small gesture, one moment of compassion, could spark something much greater. Their lives, though different, remained intertwined. Emily often thought of him as she baked, her heart full of gratitude for how he had repaid her kindness in ways she could never have expected. And he, in turn, thought of her each time he offered a helping hand, her belief in goodness reminding him of the strength in vulnerability. In the end, it wasn't about the money or even the meals shared. It was about the connection, the unspoken understanding between two people who had seen each other's struggles and chosen to act. Their story became a testament to the power of compassion, a reminder that even the smallest act of kindness could change everything. And as Emily stood in her kitchen one evening, kneading dough for a new batch of bread, she smiled. The dream of her bakery was closer than ever, but it was the journey that mattered most. A journey that began with a single meal, a quiet act of generosity, and the belief that kindness, no matter how small, always finds its way back. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create ripples we never see. A single meal, a kind word, or a moment of compassion can echo far beyond the moment, touching lives in ways we can't imagine. Take a moment to reflect. What would the world look like if each of us chose to be that spark for someone else? Your story matters. Have you experienced a moment of kindness that changed your life? Or have you been the one to offer a hand when it was needed most? Share your story in the comments. Your words could inspire someone to see the world in a new light, to believe in the power of connection and humanity. If this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Like, share, and subscribe to join a community that believes in spreading hope, one story at a time. Together, we can remind the world that even in the hardest times, kindness is the thread that weaves us all together. Let's continue this journey, because every act of compassion brings us closer to a brighter, more connected world.